When did you realize your entire family was paid actors hired to gaslight you? The first crack appeared on my 18th birthday, when Mom forgot my middle name on the cake. Not a typo. She stood there holding the frosting tube, staring at me with genuine confusion, while Dad quickly suggested we just use Happy Birthday Alex instead. My middle name is Reed. It's been Reed for 18 years. She'd written it on birthday cards, school forms, and medical documents thousands of times. But that morning, she looked at me like I was a stranger asking for directions. I brushed it off. Stress from planning the party, maybe. But when I mentioned it to my sister Jenna later, she got this weird expression and said she couldn't remember my middle name either. Then she laughed too loud and changed the subject to college applications. That night, lying in bed, I pulled out my birth certificate from my desk drawer. Alexander Reed Thompson, born March 15, 2005. The paper felt real enough under my fingers, but something cold settled in my stomach. The second crack came 3 days later when I found my baby photos. I'd been looking through old albums for a school project about family history when I noticed something strange about the pictures from my first year. Every single photo of me as a baby looked slightly off. Not obviously fake, but wrong in a way I couldn't pinpoint. The lighting seemed different from the other family photos taken during the same time period. My skin tone looked odd compared to photos of Jenna as a baby. And in several pictures, Mom's hands looked too big holding infant me, like the proportions were wrong. I brought the album to the kitchen where Mom was making dinner. She glanced at the photos and smiled, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. When I asked where these were taken, she hesitated before saying, "The hospital," but couldn't remember which hospital. When I pressed for details about my birth, she got flustered and said she'd blocked out most of the experience due to trauma. Dad walked in during this conversation and immediately started talking about a work project, steering us away from the topic entirely. That weekend, I drove to the county records office. The clerk, a woman named Patricia with kind eyes and gray hair, helped me request a copy of my original birth certificate. She typed my information into the computer and frowned. Then she typed again, slower this time. After 10 minutes of searching, she looked up at me with confusion. There was no record of Alexander Reed Thompson being born on March 15, 2005 in this county. No record of me being born anywhere in the state, actually. The panic started as a flutter in my chest and grew into something that made my hands shake. Patricia suggested I check with the hospital directly. Maybe there was a filing error. She wrote down the phone numbers of 3 hospitals in the area, but her expression remained troubled. Walking back to my car, I felt like the ground might disappear beneath my feet. How do you not exist in official records but have a birth certificate in your desk drawer? I called the first hospital from my car. The records department put me on hold for 15 minutes before coming back with the same answer. No record of my birth. The second hospital said the same thing. By the time I called the third, my voice was shaking so badly the clerk asked if I was okay. When she also found no record, I hung up and sat in the parking lot trying to breathe normally. That evening, I cornered Dad in his study. He looked up from his computer with that same forced smile I'd seen from Mom. When I told him about the records office and the hospitals, his face went pale. He started talking quickly about bureaucratic mistakes and how these things happen all the time. But when I asked him to help me figure it out, he suddenly remembered an important work call he had to make. He left the room so fast he knocked over his coffee cup. The third crack became a canyon when I decided to call my grandparents. I'd been putting it off because we weren't particularly close. But they would remember my birth, right? Grandma Dorothy answered on the second ring, sounding delighted to hear from me. But when I asked her about the day I was born, the silence stretched so long, I thought the call had dropped. Finally, she said she wasn't feeling well and would call me back later. She never did. I tried Grandpa George next. He picked up but seemed confused when I identified myself. He kept asking me to repeat my name, then said he thought I might have the wrong number. When I mentioned being Mom's son, he paused and said Linda didn't have any children. Linda is my mother's name. He hung up before I could explain further. Sleep became impossible. I'd lie awake at night replaying conversations, looking for clues I'd missed. The way Mom sometimes called me by the wrong name and quickly corrected herself. How Dad never seemed to remember stories from my childhood that I remembered clearly. The fact that I had no close friends from elementary school, no connections to neighbors or community members who'd known me as a small child. Everyone in my life seemed to have met me when I was already 10 or 11 years old. I started paying closer attention to my family's behavior. Mom would sometimes slip and mention events that happened before I was born, as if she'd been there without children. Dad had photos on his desk at work that showed him and Mom at family gatherings, but I wasn't in any of them, even ones that supposedly took place after my birth. When I asked about this, he said they'd just forgotten to bring me to those events, but there were dozens of photos spanning years. Jenna became my focus, because she'd always been the one I felt closest to. We were supposedly only 2 years apart, but when I really studied her, she looked older than 20. Her hands had tiny lines that mine didn't. She knew references to music and movies from before she was supposedly born, and she had a driver's license that listed her birth year as 1998, making her 25, not 20. I confronted Jenna on a Saturday morning when our parents were out grocery shopping. She was in her room packing for what she claimed was a college trip, but her suitcase contained professional-looking clothes and documents I couldn't see clearly. When I brought up the birth certificate issue and asked her directly how old she really was, she froze completely. For almost a minute, she just stared at me without speaking. Then she started crying. Not the dramatic tears she usually produced when she wanted something, but quiet, gut-wrenching sobs that made her whole body shake. She sat down hard on her bed and put her head in her hands. Through the crying, she whispered that she was so sorry, that she never wanted it to go this far, that she'd tried to quit multiple times but they wouldn't let her. The truth came out in broken pieces between her sobs. She wasn't my sister. None of them were my family. They were actors hired by someone she called the client to create a complete false reality around me. She'd been playing my sister for 8 years, since I was 10 years old. The job paid her 6 figures annually, plus housing and benefits, but came with an ironclad non-disclosure agreement and threats of legal and financial ruin if she ever broke character. She didn't know who the client was, or why they wanted me to believe I had this family. The instructions came through intermediaries who provided scripts for major life events, background information about my supposed history, and behavioral guidelines for how to interact with me. Everything was designed to seem natural and loving, but it was all performance. My birthdays, Christmas mornings, family vacations, heart-to-heart conversations, all of it scripted and staged. Jenna said Mom and Dad were career actors who specialized in long-term immersive roles. This wasn't their first assignment like this, though it was the longest. They had other identities and other lives outside of their time with me. Sometimes they left for work trips that were actually breaks from the performance, time to be themselves with their real families and friends. The house we lived in was rented specifically for this purpose. My bedroom had been decorated based on psychological profiles designed to make me feel comfortable and loved. The family photos throughout the house were digitally manipulated to include me, created by professionals who specialized in fabricating false memories through visual evidence. Even my school records had been manufactured to support the illusion of a normal childhood. But the worst part was what Jenna told me about surveillance. Every room in the house contained hidden cameras and microphones. My behavior, conversations, and emotional responses were being monitored and recorded continuously. Teams of psychologists analyzed the footage to refine the family's performance and ensure I remained convinced of the reality they'd created. My entire life was a research project being conducted by people I'd never met for reasons I couldn't understand. Jenna said she'd wanted to tell me the truth for years, especially as I got older and started asking questions that became harder to deflect. But her contract included penalty clauses that would destroy her financially and legally if she broke the illusion. She'd been trapped in the role just like I'd been trapped in the lie. She couldn't leave without losing everything she'd earned and facing potential criminal charges for breach of contract. When I asked her who I really was, she said she didn't know. Her information about my background was limited to what she needed to play her role convincingly. She knew I'd been placed with them when I was 10, that I'd had some kind of traumatic experience before that had affected my memory, and that the false family was supposedly part of my recovery process. But she didn't know my real name, where I'd come from, or what had happened to me. The sound of our parents' car in the driveway cut the conversation short. Jenna grabbed my hands and begged me to pretend this conversation had never happened, at least until she could figure out a way to help me safely. She said if they knew she'd broken character, they'd remove her immediately and bring in a replacement sister who wouldn't care about my well-being. At least with her, I had one person in the house who genuinely cared what happened to me. I spent the next week observing my parents with new eyes. Every interaction felt like watching a play where I was the only one who didn't know I was supposed to be acting too. Mom's loving smiles looked practiced and hollow. Dad's interest in my day seemed rehearsed and artificial. They moved around each other with the comfortable familiarity of co-workers who'd been assigned to the same project for years, not spouses who'd built a life together. I started testing them with questions about our shared history. Simple things at first. What was my favorite toy when I was younger? What song did Mom used to sing to me at bedtime? What was the first movie we watched together as a family? Their answers were detailed and confident, but something about them felt manufactured, like they were reciting information from a briefing document rather than remembering lived experiences. Then I started testing them with false memories. I'd bring up events that never happened, but described them as if they had. Dad nodding along when I mentioned the time we went fishing at Lake Morrison, except we'd never been fishing together, and there's no Lake Morrison in our area. Mom agreeing warmly when I reminisced about her making pancakes shaped like dinosaurs, even though she'd never made pancakes that weren't perfectly round. They were agreeing to false memories because they were afraid of contradicting me and breaking the illusion. They'd rather pretend to remember something that never happened than risk me questioning the reality they'd constructed. The realization made me feel sick and furious at the same time. I needed proof that would hold up beyond my own observations and Jenna's confession. Late one night, I started searching the house systematically for evidence of the surveillance Jenna had mentioned. It took me 3 hours to find the first camera, hidden inside what looked like a smoke detector in the living room. The lens was tiny but visible if you knew what to look for. Once I found the first one, the others became easier to spot. There were cameras in every room except the bathrooms, cleverly concealed inside everyday objects. The one in my bedroom was built into a digital clock that had been there for years. I'd fallen asleep, changed clothes, cried, and had private phone conversations, all while being recorded by people whose names I didn't even know. The microphones were even more invasive. I found them in light switches, electrical outlets, and picture frames. Every word spoken in the house was being captured and analyzed. No conversation was private, no emotion was unmonitored. I'd been living in a surveillance facility disguised as a loving home for 8 years, but finding the surveillance equipment also gave me an opportunity. If they were watching me constantly, then they'd seen me discover the cameras. They knew that I knew. The game was about to change, and I needed to be ready. The next morning, I woke up to find Jenna gone. Her room was empty, her belongings removed, and when I asked Mom where she was, she looked confused. She said she didn't know who I was talking about, that I'd never had a sister. When I insisted and showed her photos of Jenna on my phone, she suggested I might be having some kind of episode and offered to make me a doctor's appointment. Dad came home from work that evening with the same story. No sister, no idea who I meant when I described Jenna, concern about my mental state for insisting someone existed who never had. They delivered these lines with the same practiced care they'd used for 8 years, but now I could see the performance underneath. They'd replaced Jenna and erased her from the official story. Whoever was running this operation had backup plans for containment when actors broke character. I wondered how many other family members had been removed and replaced over the years without me noticing. How many different versions of Mom and Dad had I lived with? That weekend, I told them I was going to the library to study. Instead, I drove to the offices of a private investigator I'd found online. Rebecca Martinez had kind eyes and 20 years of experience with missing persons and identity fraud. I told her everything: the missing birth records, the actors pretending to be my family, the surveillance, and Jenna's confession before her disappearance. Rebecca listened without judgment and took detailed notes. She said she'd seen cases of elaborate deception before, usually involving inheritance fraud or witness protection, but never anything this comprehensive. She agreed to help me find out who I really was and why someone had created this false life around me. Her standard rate was $200 per day plus expenses, money I could cover using savings from birthday gifts and part-time jobs over the years. We started with the house itself. Rebecca's research revealed that the property was leased to a shell company that traced back to a larger corporation specializing in psychological research and therapeutic intervention. The company, MindBridge Solutions, had government contracts and private clients who required specialized services for individuals with traumatic backgrounds. The deeper Rebecca dug, the more disturbing the picture became. MindBridge Solutions had been operating for 15 years, providing what they called immersive therapeutic environments for children and adults who'd experienced severe trauma. The company's literature described creating safe, controlled families and communities where subjects could heal and develop healthy relationships without the triggers and complications of their original environments. But the fine print revealed something darker. Subjects were not considered clients, but rather research participants. Their responses to various stimuli, their emotional development, and their ability to form attachments were all being studied and documented. The fake families weren't just therapeutic tools, they were laboratories for psychological experiments conducted on people who'd never consented to be test subjects. Rebecca found records of my placement with MindBridge when I was 10 years old. The file was heavily redacted, but key details were visible. I'd been removed from an abusive situation and placed in state custody. Instead of traditional foster care, I'd been selected for MindBridge's intensive family integration program, based on psychological profiles that indicated I'd be a suitable research subject. My real name was Alexander Cole, and my original case file mentioned severe trauma related to witnessing violence in my biological family. The state had authorized MindBridge's intervention as an experimental treatment, with the understanding that traditional therapy had failed and more intensive measures were necessary for my recovery. But there was no mention of my consent to participate in the program, no discussion of my right to know the truth about my situation, and no plan for ever returning me to reality. As far as the documentation showed, I was intended to remain in the false family environment indefinitely while researchers studied my adaptation and development. Rebecca also found financial records showing that my care was being funded by a private foundation with connections to pharmaceutical companies researching treatments for trauma-related disorders. I wasn't just a research subject. I was a long-term investment in developing marketable therapies that could be sold to governments and healthcare systems worldwide. The most chilling discovery was a progress report dated just 2 months earlier. It described me as an ideal subject who had fully integrated into the constructed environment and showed no signs of questioning the reality presented to him. The report recommended continuing the program indefinitely, while gradually introducing more complex psychological stressors to test the limits of my adaptation. But my recent behavior, asking questions about birth records and family history, had triggered a containment protocol. Jenna's removal was just the beginning. The report outlined plans to introduce new stressors designed to make me doubt my own perceptions and stop investigating my past. If that failed, they had authorization to relocate me to a more controlled environment with a completely new constructed family. I was running out of time. The people monitoring me through the surveillance system knew that I was becoming suspicious, and they were already implementing countermeasures. Rebecca and I needed to act quickly before they moved me to a location where I'd be even more isolated and controlled. Rebecca contacted a lawyer she'd worked with on previous cases involving unlawful detention and psychological abuse. David Kim specialized in cases where vulnerable individuals had been exploited by institutions claiming to help them. He reviewed the evidence we'd gathered and confirmed that what Mindbridge was doing constituted false imprisonment and human experimentation without consent. But proving it in court would be challenging because so much of the documentation was classified or protected by research privacy laws. We needed more direct evidence of the deception and the harm it had caused. David suggested we might need to create a situation where the people running the program would expose themselves by reacting to a perceived threat. The plan we developed was dangerous but necessary. I would return home and confront my fake parents directly about their real identities and the nature of their work. Rebecca would be parked outside with recording equipment to capture their responses. If they reacted by trying to contain me or remove me from the house, we'd have evidence of false imprisonment. If they continued the charade, at least I'd have their denials on record to contradict with the documentation we'd already gathered. That evening, I walked into the kitchen where Mom and Dad were preparing dinner together with their usual practiced domestic harmony. I sat down at the table and told them I knew they were actors hired to pretend to be my family. I explained that I'd found the surveillance equipment, discovered the truth about Mindbridge Solutions, and learned about the research program I'd been enrolled in without my knowledge or consent. Their reactions were immediate and revealing. Mom dropped the wooden spoon she'd been holding and went completely pale. Dad's carefully maintained facade cracked, and for the first time in 8 years, I saw genuine emotion cross his face. Fear. They looked at each other with the silent communication of people who'd worked together for years, not the intimate connection of married partners. Dad recovered first and tried to restart the performance. He used his concerned father voice to suggest that I was having some kind of breakdown, that the stress of applying to colleges might be affecting my mental health. But his delivery was off, rushed and uncertain in a way it had never been before. Mom joined in, but she kept glancing toward the hidden cameras as if looking for guidance from whoever was watching. She suggested we call a doctor, that someone could help me work through these delusions I was having. But when I asked her to call my pediatrician, she hesitated because she didn't actually know who my real doctor was supposed to be. I pushed harder, demanding they tell me their real names and how long they'd been working for Mindbridge. I described the financial records Rebecca had found, the research reports documenting my behavior, and the plans to relocate me if I became too problematic. With each detail I revealed, their performances became more strained and desperate. Finally, Dad broke character completely. He said they couldn't discuss their work due to confidentiality agreements, but that everything they'd done was designed to help me heal from traumatic experiences I'd been too young to process properly. He claimed the false family environment had given me stability and love that I never would have received in traditional foster care. But when I asked him what those traumatic experiences had been, he couldn't answer. When I demanded to know my real last name, he looked genuinely confused. When I asked to see documentation of my consent to participate in the program, he said I'd been too young to make those decisions when I arrived. Mom started crying, but these weren't the manipulative tears I'd seen her produce countless times over the years. These were the exhausted sobs of someone who'd been living a lie for so long she'd started to believe it herself. She said she'd grown to care about me despite the artificial nature of our relationship, that watching me grow up had made her question whether what they were doing was ethical. She admitted that she and Dad were professional actors who specialized in long-term therapeutic role-playing. They'd been hired to provide me with a stable family environment, while researchers studied my emotional development and attachment patterns. But over 8 years, the lines between performance and genuine care had become blurred for both of them. Dad said they'd never been told the full scope of the research or the ultimate plans for my future. They received scripts for major interactions and behavioral guidelines, but much of their parenting had been improvised based on their professional training and personal instincts. They'd created a loving home for me within the constraints of their roles, even as they knew the foundation was built on deception. But they also revealed the darker aspects of their work. They confirmed that every moment of my life in the house was being monitored and analyzed. Teams of psychologists reviewed footage of my behavior to identify patterns and triggers that could be used to develop therapeutic interventions for other trauma survivors. My responses to various stimuli, my relationships with them, and my emotional growth were all data points in a larger research project. They said other children were involved in similar programs, that I wasn't the only person living in a constructed reality while being studied by researchers. Mindbridge operated multiple fake families and communities, all designed to test different approaches to treating severe trauma and developmental disorders. The knowledge that other people were trapped in similar situations made my anger burn even hotter. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of cars pulling into our driveway. Through the window, I could see black sedans with tinted windows and men in suits getting out. Dad's face went white when he saw them, and he told me to run. These weren't police or social workers. They were Mindbridge's security team, sent to contain the situation before it could escalate further. I ran toward the back door, but Mom grabbed my arm and pressed something into my hand, a small piece of paper with an address written on it. She whispered that it was where my real case files were stored, information that MindBridge kept separate from their official research documents. She said she'd been secretly copying files for months, planning to find a way to help me learn the truth about my past. The security team was already inside the house as I slipped out through the sliding door in the kitchen. I could hear them talking to Mom and Dad in professional, clipped tones about containing the situation and implementing the relocation protocol. I ran across the backyard and through a gap in the fence that led to the street where Rebecca was waiting in her car. We drove straight to David Kim's office, where he was waiting with emergency legal paperwork. Using the evidence we'd gathered and my testimony about the confrontation with my fake parents, he filed for an emergency restraining order against MindBridge Solutions and a preliminary injunction to prevent them from relocating me or interfering with my freedom. But we all knew that legal processes moved slowly, and MindBridge had resources and connections that could make me disappear long before any court order took effect. We needed to expose the program publicly and immediately, creating enough attention and scrutiny that they couldn't simply make me vanish. Rebecca had been recording everything through equipment hidden in her car during my confrontation with Mom and Dad. The audio clearly captured their admissions about being actors, their descriptions of the surveillance and research, and their confirmation that other children were involved in similar programs. Combined with the documentation we'd already gathered, we had enough evidence to prove that MindBridge was operating an illegal human experimentation program. David contacted journalists he'd worked with on previous cases involving institutional abuse and cover-ups. Within hours, reporters from 3 major news outlets were reviewing our evidence and preparing stories that would expose MindBridge's activities to public scrutiny. The plan was to publish simultaneously across multiple platforms, making it impossible for the company to suppress the story or discredit a single source. But first, we needed to follow up on the address Mom had given me. Rebecca drove me to a storage facility across town where she'd rented a unit using a fake name. Inside, we found boxes of files that Mom had been secretly copying for months, detailed case records for dozens of children who'd been placed in MindBridge's programs over the past 15 years. My real file was there, complete and unredacted. Reading it was like discovering I was a different person entirely. My name was Alexander Cole, and I'd been placed in state custody at age 8 after witnessing my father murder my mother during a domestic violence incident. I'd suffered severe PTSD, selective mutism, and attachment disorders that made traditional foster placement nearly impossible. The state had authorized experimental treatment through MindBridge when I was 10, after 2 years of failed placements and unsuccessful therapy, but the consent documents were signed by social workers and state officials. There was no record of anyone ever asking me what I wanted or explaining what the program would involve. The most devastating discovery was a psychological evaluation from when I first arrived at the fake family. It described me as a severely traumatized child who desperately wanted to believe in the loving parents and sister who'd been provided for him. The report noted that I'd adapted to the false environment with remarkable speed because it gave me everything I'd been denied in my real childhood: safety, consistency, and unconditional love. But it also noted that my attachment to the fake family was so complete that revealing the deception would likely cause significant psychological damage. The researchers had recommended maintaining the illusion indefinitely while studying how I developed relationships and processed emotions within the controlled environment. Other files revealed the full scope of MindBridge's operations. There were dozens of children like me, placed in constructed families and communities where every aspect of their lives was monitored and controlled. Some were survivors of abuse, others had developmental disorders or behavioral problems that made them difficult to place in traditional settings. The company marketed their services as cutting-edge therapeutic interventions, but the reality was human experimentation on vulnerable children who'd never been told they were research subjects. The fake families were laboratories, and we were specimens being studied to develop profitable treatments for trauma and mental illness. Reading through case file after case file of children who'd been deceived and manipulated in the name of research, I felt a rage so pure and focused, it surprised me. These people had stolen years of our lives, violated our trust, and treated us like objects to be studied rather than human beings deserving of truth and dignity. The news stories broke 3 days later across major networks and newspapers simultaneously. The headlines were devastating for MindBridge. Children used as unknowing test subjects in psychological experiments. Fake families hide human research program. Company deceives trauma survivors for profit. The public reaction was immediate and fierce. Child welfare advocates demanded investigations into how state agencies had allowed such programs to operate. Lawmakers called for hearings into the regulation of psychological research involving vulnerable populations. Former employees of MindBridge began coming forward with additional evidence of the company's unethical practices. Within a week, federal investigators had raided MindBridge's facilities and seized thousands of documents detailing their research programs. The FBI opened a criminal investigation into charges of false imprisonment, fraud, and conducting illegal human experiments. The state agencies that had referred children to MindBridge faced their own investigations for failing to protect vulnerable youth in their custody. But the most satisfying moment came when I testified before a congressional subcommittee investigating the program. Sitting at a table facing lawmakers and cameras, I described what it felt like to discover that your entire life had been a performance staged for the benefit of researchers you'd never met. I explained how the fake love and manufactured family bonds had felt more real to me than anything I'd experienced before, making the betrayal even more devastating when I learned the truth. The congresswoman leading the hearing asked me what I wanted to see happen to the people responsible. I said I wanted other children currently trapped in similar programs to be freed and given real choices about their futures. I wanted the researchers who'd designed these experiments to face criminal charges for what they'd done to us. And I wanted systems put in place to ensure that vulnerable children would never again be treated as research subjects without their knowledge and consent. 6 months later, MindBridge Solutions was permanently shut down, and its executives were facing federal criminal charges. 43 children were removed from fake family environments and provided with real therapeutic support to help them process what had been done to them. New laws were passed requiring informed consent for any psychological research involving minors, with mandatory advocacy to ensure children understood what they were agreeing to participate in. I never saw Mom, Dad, or Jenna again. Rebecca's investigation revealed that they'd been relocated to other assignments within days of my confrontation with them. Part of me wondered if they ever thought about the 8 years we'd spent together, whether any of the love they'd shown me had been real despite the artificial circumstances that created it. I'm 21 now, living under my real name and building genuine relationships with people who know my true history. The transition wasn't easy, learning to trust that people's feelings for me were authentic when I'd spent 8 years believing in manufactured love took intensive therapy and patience from friends who understood what I'd been through. But for the first time in my life, I know that every conversation, every emotion, and every connection is real.